Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We are excited to start our next session, sessions 5 and 6. We'll start with our session on Beyond Carbon, looking to a lot of different topics and thoughts here on more than just the carbon capture and carbon sink. So I'm excited to introduce our moderator, Tim Tenson from TerraGenesis, and he'll kick us off. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Martha. Hi, everyone. As Martha said, I'm Tim Tenson. I am the Chief Innovation Officer at TerraGenesis, and we have a really broad scope of work at our company. We do a lot of work with brands and sustainability consulting and their investment programs for regenerative agriculture. We work a lot with smallholder farmers on the ground, largely in the global south, and we also do a lot on farm enterprise planning and other related farmer support work. A lot of my work is actually focused on our outcome monitoring and verification work. So how we actually monitor impacts on the ground from changes in farm practices and how those correlate with rewards, either from in-setting programs with brands or through other kind of market-based incentives. In addition to that, part of the reason I'm here is, I've spent the past couple of years developing ecological monitoring programs at educational and research farms like Stone Barn Center in Tarrytown, New York, and White Buffalo Land Trust in Santa Barbara, California. And I've also worked a fair amount with interdisciplinary teams at the Earthshot Institute, looking at the way in which the existing data for soil science from different sources, both ground and remote sensing, can be used to help us better understand and predict changes in soil health and soil carbon over time. And the reason we're all here today is because there's been a growing attention on soil carbon beyond just the above ground biomass as a solution for diverse issues, not only climate change, but also farm financing and economics and transition financing from practices. Carbon offsets are also gaining increasing scrutiny from a diversity of sources. Nonprofit research organizations like Carbon Plan that are doing audits and really great research, academics who are reviewing these different methods and trying to understand how to increase the trust and transparency, as well as popular media programs, as recently as this past week with John Oliver, last week tonight, talking about carbon offsets. And this is an important process to refine the way that we reward certain practices that draw down carbon. But there's a lot more to soil health than just the carbon, as we know. And today we have some excellent speakers joining us, including myself, to look at how we go beyond just carbon as a measure of soil health to other indicators like chemical and biological indicators. So we have Alejandro Plastina here, an associate professor of agricultural and natural resource economics at Iowa State University. We have Max Neumeyer from Ground Up Consulting, and hopefully we'll be joined by Ron Zink, VP of Product Development and Strategy at Trace Genomics. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to each of the speakers to tell a little bit more about themselves and their perspective. So let's start with Alejandro, since you're top of my screen.
All right, thank you, Tim, and good morning, everyone. As Tim mentioned, I'm Alejandro Plastina. I'm an associate professor of economics and extension economist at Iowa State University with a focus on farm, business, and financial management. So my research addresses the economics of conservation practices and voluntary carbon programs. In 2021, I received the Agricultural Economics Fellowship from the Farm Foundation to provide an objective assessment of the potential of agricultural carbon markets in the US. And currently, I'm collaborating with the USDA Economic Research Service, as well as the Agronomy, Crop, and Soil Science Societies of America to enhance our understanding of voluntary agricultural carbon markets. So with that, I'll pass it to Max.
Hi, my name is Max Neumeyer. I'm a principal at Ground Up Consulting. Previously, we organized the Colorado Collaborative for Healthy Soils, which is a project that's finished now. It was a stakeholder process that resulted in a soil health bill for the state, as well as the development of a soil health program. And we work now with our clients, Colorado Department of Agriculture and Colorado State University, to run this program, and it's called the Colorado STAR program. And just briefly, Colorado STAR is an opportunity for farmers and ranchers to try out new practices on one field as they consider adopting them across their operation. It includes technical assistance, incentive payments, free soil health tests, capacity support, equipment grants for conservation districts. It uses the STAR rating system, which is a practice-based rating system, 1 star being average, 5 stars being fully regenerative. And it's meant to be a celebration of success and maybe someday a market signal. The STAR Plus program in Colorado also includes a research partnership with CSU, investigating particularly the soil water nexus, and a communications campaign directed towards farmers and ranchers, the creation of economic tools and educational materials for producers, sociological research, and some other things. It's currently running with 130 participants and may be expanding, but I can talk more about the STAR Plus program or the Colorado Collaborative for Healthy Soils as people are interested. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Max. And Ron, it'd be great to hear from you as well.
Hi, Ron Zank. I'm with Trace Genomics. I'm the VP of Product and Strategy. Trace Genomics pioneered the application of human genomic sequencing to soils. So looking at who's in the soil using DNA technology. Our customer base really works with farmers and ag retail, as well as product companies that are looking to move to nature-based solutions like biologicals. And the third area is around environmental social governance. Companies, consumer packaged goods, for example, looking through what's their supply chain look like and how sustainable is that supply chain. So happy to be here.
Thanks, Ron. So what I'd like to do is, if anyone has questions for us, you can feel free to type them in the questions for the program. But I'd like to start us off just with a question to get us all framing the issue a little bit from each of our perspectives. So the question I'd like to start with is, what are the opportunities and challenges you see, whether they be technological opportunities or challenges, social or knowledge-based or funding, in understanding and valuing other aspects of soil health beyond carbon?
I'll kick us off. The goal of our work we see as being the widespread adoption of soil health practices in Colorado and the West. And the idea behind the program we've developed is that there are many barriers to this goal. There's economic barriers, there's sociological barriers, environmental barriers, context-specific barriers. And it's not enough just to reduce one of these barriers, because then there's other ones standing in the way. We really need to work on all these things at once. And so this program we've tried to put together is trying to address several pieces of this puzzle, and carbon is just one of them. And in fact, in the West, water is king. And we're trying to make the case to farmers and ranchers to try out these practices. And then the hope is that these practices stand on their own for their economic logic, for their environmental logic, for the fact that it addresses drought resilience. And so those are some thoughts to kick us off. I don't know if I answered your question, but hopefully those are relevant.
Yeah, well, Max, just following up on that quickly, I'd be curious to understand too about the program and its applicability to other Western states or other states that could replicate it, or if you see it as something which is really specific to the interests and environment of Colorado.
No, we really believe in the states as policy laboratories model. And what we're doing in Colorado has had some success. We're in our first year. There's a lot of excitement around it. It's too soon to know if our theory of change is working. But part of this sociological research and evaluation is to see what works and what doesn't. We're also piloting a pay for performance model where farmers and ranchers get a one-time change incentive for improving their STAR rating. We hope to pilot a peer-to-peer learning model and then evaluate which of those works so other states, particularly Western states, but other states in general can adopt this programming. And we actually have a climate smart commodities grant that would do that we're waiting on, like everyone else in the world right now. So those are some, that's where we stand right now.
Thanks, Max.
I'll go ahead. I think to me, this panel's beyond carbon. So the challenge I see is, what does success look like? And then how do we get there? Do we even agree, where we're going? I think in some ways we maybe do. The success to us is more regenerative farming, right? How do you get companies and farmers to embrace technologies and techniques that move beyond synthetic fertilizer, or at least an and with synthetic fertilizer? One of the challenges I see is, everyone wants to model the world, and modeling is great, but at some point you get what you pay for. And what Trace Genomics is trying to do is bring a measure plus model approach to bring in more truth data to get to where we want to be sustainably. And the other thing we're trying to do is, a lot of the metrics are really fill out a form. What'd you do the last 5 years? What'd you do the last 20 years? We all know inherently there's noise in that system. And so how do you really believe, what you're trying to do? How do you really believe the measurements? And so we're trying to address that as well.
Yeah, well, I fully agree with what Ron mentioned, and the cost effectiveness of the technologies, different technologies out there, is the area right now on how to measure, how to report, the consistency of those measures, and the availability of comparable measures across farms and across carbon programs. And in particular to the comparability, and since we are looking beyond carbon, I would say that one of the major challenges right now for farmers trying to implement changes in their practices to become more environmentally friendly, or regenerative ag focused, is that typically when those programs or those changes in practices are promoted, they are promoted with some caveats, right? So in the short run, the farmer might see a decrease in yields, or some hurt in profitability, but usually the statement ends saying, but in the long run, the value of that land will go up, and the landowner will be able to capture not only higher yields, but also higher land value. Well, right now, let me bring you bad news. The rules by which rural appraisers develop the appraisals and then therefore put a value to a piece of land, a tract of land, do not allow for the incorporation of soil health metrics into the evaluation. So the major question, and we conducted research on that, right? We hired appraisers to do the work for us. And the conclusion is that if we really want to incentivize the monetization of soil health, then the first thing we need is a database of soil health metrics to which rural appraisers can refer to when comparing one farm against similar farms in the area. So that's the comparable approach, and that's the most used approach in rural farmland. So we, beyond carbon, we need to start thinking about how to monetize soil health, for the long-term approach, and developing something like a regional database with soil health metrics that are consistent, robust, and comparable. That would help a lot in fostering these carbon markets, ecosystem markets, and other markets in the future.
Thank you, Alejandro. And we have our first question. And so this one is for Ron, but anyone else can feel free to answer from their perspective. So how do you address the inherent noise in capturing practices history? Do you avoid the need for that kind of baseline, or what's your opinion there?
Yeah, I'm going to share a slide if I can. Is this coming across? Okay. So what we've done, and another challenge, of course, is it's not a go-it-alone world, and Trace Genomics should be one of the first to stand up and say all our small company can't solve all the problems, but we are trying to show some leadership in how would you go about with an objective measurement of what soil health can look like. And what we've created is a score that's 0 to 10 based on 4 components: the biodiversity of the score, carbon, water, and nutrients. And we use DNA, soil texture, and other components to bring in an objective measurement of what that field looks like. And what's really fascinating about this is you don't need to know the pedigree. This is all based on first science principles, things from the United Nations, looking at the Soil Health Institute's body of work, saying we can objectively come in and say, how sustainable has this field been treated, almost irrespective of these practices. I mean, they all contribute to them, but we don't need to know if you tilled or didn't till. We don't need to know if you planted a cover crop or didn't. So this is a slow moving metric that we have shared and we're using right now for ESG purposes. It isn't probably the only way to do it, but we think it's a good way that inherently brings in a measure plus model approach. And you can start to apply what you've learned in one part of the field to another in order to make this more scalable. Also, it's something that's slow moving, so the measurement itself probably only needs to be done similar to carbon on the order of 4 to 5 years as opposed to yearly.
If I understand correctly, Ron, what you're getting at is that with the sustainable soil performance rating, you can move away from the need for any kind of farm records or kind of subjective representation of how land use history has impacted soil.
We think you can, and yet you still want to probably track those, because the idea would be to say, what's the combination of effects that will do a better job? And so we know, regen practices by and large work, but how do they work? Which ones matter? And there's a lot more energy that could go into, well, you want to plant a cover crop. What is the composition of that cover crop for the soil that you're working against, or the ultimate crop you plan to plant? I mean, there's so much more we could be doing around thinking through that. This metric provides mechanisms to start to understand trend lines and success around those ideas.
I was going to take this opportunity to share an unpopular opinion, which is that we really believe right now that we need to reward farmers and ranchers based on practices. It's great to measure outcomes, but we don't really feel, and I'm not a soil scientist or a technologist, but personally don't really think the technology is there yet to accurately measure changes in soil carbon. So while we develop these outcome-based systems, we think it's best to reward based on practices. There's also equity concerns around geography if we reward farmers and ranchers based on outcomes. And I think what we're really trying to do is get them to adopt new practices. And so that's where we focus on with our programming. But I still applaud this work and think we need to develop these outcomes-based measurement systems and rating systems more.
Yeah, maybe to respond to that, Max, I'd both agree and disagree. I mean, I think the outcome really is what we should be measuring. We've tried hard to normalize this so we can compare Arizona soil to soil in Iowa and have a apples to apples comparison. I really can't tell you scientifically how the guys did that or gals, but it works. But I think, Alejandro brought this up too. The real question here is, what is the reward to farmers for the risk that they are going to take, or the perceived risk they're taking, or the added expense they're going to do to get to where we all want them to go? And if we can solve the reward side of this, then you can get to the how to get there, practices management, et cetera. And that's the real question. And you are seeing, I think, this past year, to me, the optimism around Gen Z and climate change and the carbon components all moving towards consumer packaged goods companies really caring about this. Yeah. And are they going to take a leadership role that says, I'm willing to pay 3 more cents a bushel of corn because it's sustainably grown? And if we get to that point, you're going to go to a carrot, which is you're a sustainable farmer, to eventually maybe a stick that you're not a sustainable farmer. But let's start with the carrot. And if we can do that, I think we're all going to be happier.
Max, did you want to respond to that?
Well, I totally believe in the supply chain partners. The STAR program first may become a brand enhancement tool, and then it's directly connecting STAR participants with supply chain partners who are willing to pay more for them to go up a star. And then from there, hopefully it's revenue premium someday. So I totally agree with that, and I share some of your optimism that you described.
Thanks, Max. We have another really great question that I think is an important one when we're talking about not just carbon, but other soil health indicators. And it relates to the attribution or the ability to actually say that the management itself is responsible for the changes that we're observing. And so the question is, soil organic carbon can change relatively slowly in dryland systems. So is Trace Genomics thinking about how or if microbes can act as a leading indicator to forecast those changes? Or is there a way to provide information on management relevant to policy timescales?
Yeah, I think it's both. So what we're trying to do, obviously it's difficult to measure carbon year to year. We all know that. But what you can do is measure the environment conducive to capturing carbon and also understand what practices led to that environment or would increase it. And so that's what we're trying to do through the microbial composition. What microbes are more apt to convert nitrogen into a held state as opposed to a release state? And we're working hard on those. And then it will be a combination of factors. I mean, there might be some biologicals that you can apply that help you do that, but also the management practices are going to matter a lot too. And so we're trying to look at it like, we don't really care how you get there. If you have a great environment, let's understand how to maintain it or help people emulate it.
Thanks, Ron. And Alejandro, I'd be curious, we've heard a little bit about the STAR program and as a strategy to incentivize these practice changes, and from Ron about methods for actually at a granular detail understanding what some of those changes are on the chemical biological level. Do you see some other strategies for creating market incentives, either through carbon markets or some other measure to help farmers transition to practices that are more conducive to overall soil health?
Yeah, so if we look at the history of conservation practices, there has been plenty of incentives from USDA, from state programs to implement cover crops, no-till, and so on. And now with the development or the advent of these carbon programs, there are more incentives. It's clear to me that since these carbon programs are based on different models, it's not fully transparent to the farmer which carbon program makes the most sense to a particular farm. So they are really hard to compare, and I tried really hard to do that. So they are really hard to compare, but they provide incentives. Now, if we look at the rate of adoption of some conservation practices, we're looking at 27% of no-till adoption, according to the US Census 2017, across the nation. No-till is much lower, 3 to 4% only. So these are not new practices. So that means that if the incentives are available and not used to a larger extent, maybe it's because the costs outweigh the benefits of implementing those conservation practices with those incentives in place in some parts of the country. So creating more incentives is one way to go, providing more carrots, as Ron said, through not only carbon programs, but also ecosystem service payments. In some cases, payment per output might not be enough. As Max said, maybe payments per practice make more sense to go forward, but the economics are such that you need to be profitable to be sustainable long term. So we need to take into account the bottom line when doing these calculations for farmers. They will participate if they see a potential profit, and also and not a huge increase in risks, because that's the other part. You can have unexpected profit coming your way in 5 to 10 years, but the risks involved in that calculation are too high. And right now, I think the risks are very large for many farmers. So that's why they are participating with small tracts of land, and there's some hesitancy to fully embrace these new carbon markets, carbon programs.
Now, I'd agree with that on the carbon side. To me, what isn't risky, but we can't really get many people to embrace is the over application of nitrogen and phosphorus. We know we have the technology to show you that you do not need to apply so much of these mined fertilizers, and yet we do it because everyone is so concerned about that report card at the end of the year that is yield. And this is where I think through education and through some other incentives, if we could just get people to make smart choices, we're all better off. And I think we have the technology to do it. And so that's one area I think, Alejandro, beyond carbon, how do we just encourage that and then truly show it so people can do that. When you have 40 chances, the risk factor plays in a lot, right? To change your practices. Yeah.
That's really interesting. So I think we've heard from Alejandro about, there's this gap there where the programs and incentives exist, but the benefits may not outweigh the expense or the risk of going into those programs or participating. And there's also an instance where we have the technology to reduce reliance on artificial fertilizers, and we don't see those same changes aligned with those technologies. I'm curious, Max, do you see a role for the STAR program in supporting that type of program participation, or as kind of as a tool to maybe de-risk some of those practice changes?
Yeah, we're trying to de-risk them, and we're also trying to provide a pathway to new opportunities. So it's try one field, not your whole operation. Try one field out in new conservation practices. See how it goes. Understand the economics of that field. Understand the potential carbon benefits and water benefits you're providing, so that you know which opportunities you can participate in. And then 3 years down the road, apply for EQIP, apply for CSP, participate in a carbon market, find another initiative that pays you to do these things, a new supply chain partner. So we're trying to de-risk it in that way, not so much by increasing the incentives, but it's also a sociological experiment. We're trying to drum up social excitement around this, connect people to each other, to learn from one another, celebrate success, and focus on all those other ways that get in the way of trying new practices. So I think all that is a big part of it. The bottom line is, Alejandro's exactly right. It has to work for the bottom line.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point too about the sociological aspect. So, we just have a few more minutes here before we switch, but, I'd be curious, Max, to hear, or from anyone, some of the opportunities for that peer learning, and having it not just be the state or, the federal policies, but actually like seeing other farmers and being able to learn and maybe even see kind of the financial impacts of those changes.
That's what we hope to do going forward. We haven't been able to put a peer-to-peer learning component into place yet.
I can say that land-grant universities provide a lot of educational learning opportunities, through field days, through all kinds of engagements with farmers and NGOs. And I think the land-grant universities are trying to educate along these lines of using the optimal amount of nitrogen fertilizer. There are tools out there sponsored by land-grant universities that suggest lower nitrogen uses, optimal use compared to the actual nitrogen use. But the reality is that there are lots of incentives already embedded in farming to not go down to the optimal levels. Think, for example, crop insurance, and we can have another full session on that.
Yeah.
Well, everyone, I think we are at time now and ready to shift over to our next session. So with that, I will thank all of our panelists and hand it over to Martha.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, Tim. Thanks to Ron, Alejandro, and Max for this great panel today. Stay put here with this live stream in the Event Hub, and we'll get started right away with session 6, Beyond the U.S., where we'll be looking at how other countries and multinational organizations are approaching challenges like soil collection, analysis, and ecosystems markets. It's my pleasure now to introduce Tyler McCann. He's the Managing Director at the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. So Tyler, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Martha, and thank you to the Farm Foundation for inviting me to join you today. this has been an interesting conference that I've been able to catch parts of, and I think it's when you look at this issue beyond the United States, I think we get into an interesting situation of sometimes we think the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. I think often in Canada, when we look at how soil carbon markets are playing out, we're quite envious of the progress being made, but the content, the discussions that you've had over the last 2 days have highlighted some of the challenges that exist. And again, I think challenges that probably do exist all around the world. And we're going to dive into that today. We've got a panel of 4 individuals that join us from around the world, coming with some different backgrounds, and I think are going to add quite a bit of value to this discussion and bring some context. I won't provide an introduction of all of the panelists. Their bios are available on that webpage. If you look up above the video, you can click and you can find out more. But what I will do is start by turning to them all with to ask one question, and we'll encourage them all to share where they're coming from and a bit about who they are and how they approach this issue. But the question that I wanted to start really is around this. I think that this reality, this recognition of the role that soil health plays, the benefits that come from soil health, the opportunities around carbon markets and revenue, new revenue streams for farmers is a global phenomenon. It's something that people around the world are looking at. But again, some of these challenges are also challenges whether or not you're trying to implement these practices in the United States, if you're or in Europe or Australia or Canada. I think it's important to start with a bit of a level setting exercise and really just to ask a simple question. So can you share with the audience, how do you see soil health data impacting the ag value chain in the region where you're from? What role is it or is it not playing in carbon markets? What are the challenges that you're experiencing? But let's start with a bit of a level setting question around the world. And so I'd like to start going to Andrew Ward. So Andrew, if, the floor will go over to you. If you can share where you're from and the background that you're approaching this question with, and then answer that question around how soil health data impacting the ag value chain.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name's Andrew Ward. I'm from Australia, and I'm one of the first 2 employees of Regen Farmers Mutual. And I guess our technology is as much social technology as it is actual technology. So by being farmer owned and farmer centric and coming out from that farmer position as an environmental markets broker, we're able to negotiate with the combined power of our farmers, but we're also able to bring to market insights from the farmers that the buy side can then relate to. And I guess in relation to that point about soil health, in Australia, there's a bit of a schism. The market wants to talk about carbon, and the farmers that we represent want to talk about soil health, where carbon is an outcome alongside green provenance and productivity outcomes. And so we're looking at monetization around not just carbon, but green provenance and production values. And I feel very fortunate in Australia, relatively, like we definitely have challenges, but our soil science history has been quite good. And we lobbied back at Kyoto for directly measured soil when coming to carbon, as opposed to modeled. And that means we have historically huge volumes of soil data to pull from, a national soil registry, quite sophisticated in-field infrastructure. Most farmers already understand the value of getting soil tests done, particularly in a broad acre setting. And so we don't maybe have some of the resistances that or challenges of some of the other areas, but we certainly have our own sets of challenges. So hopefully that helps set a bit of context from where Regen Farmers Mutual and myself come from.
Right. I appreciate that, and we'll dive into more of the challenges. But I'm curious, if you look at that infrastructure that exists in that long history that's there, I think that interoperability of soil health data and consistency is a big part of the discussion at this event. Does that effectively, has that issue been resolved in Australia because you have a consistent history? You know, when you're looking at aggregating the information from your farmer members, are they coming to you with a standard set of soil health data that you can use and then market?
Yes and no, not a standardized set, but Australia exists in this oligopoly or misopsony kind of state where there's relatively few larger organizations that end up dominating markets. And because we've been through that maturity curve, there's essentially three major laboratory testing organizations in Australia and one chief scientific body. And so there has been a plethora, and then it's consolidated, and now there is interoperability between those main soil testing labs and our research, like our cooperative research centers, which are the CRCs. That they've been working interoperability between universities on research for quite a while.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go next to Jordan. Jordan, you come to us from Mistra Ag. I was wondering if you could again speak a little bit about the background, the role that you play there, what the company is doing, and how you see soil health data impacting the work that you do and from the sky and on the ground.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tyler. I come from a background in agronomy and GIS, and at Bumitra, our goal is to combine those things, working with remote sensing and then also large amounts of soil data to help reward farmers for accelerating carbon removal at a large scale. And so a lot of our efforts in that involve going to several different countries. Currently, we operate in 4 continents, and we operate in many more unique ecosystems than that. But our primary soil efforts at the time are focused on small landholders in India, tribal-owned conservation lands in East Africa, large grazing ranches in Mexico, and then also down in South America. And as you can imagine, there is a broad range of how that data may be given to us, how it is collected, and there's an entire new suite of difficulties that we run into there than instead of just the data that we are able to access here in the US. So at Bumitra, we run into a lot of issues of trying to gather that data, first of all, put it into the proper formats, and then be able to turn it into usable products. But as other people have alluded to all during the other sessions here, all of those things are, of course, essential for just giving the information to decision makers to help create management strategies for their lands. And so we can get into that more as we go later on, but I do think that that's important to recognize that not everything operates in the same sort of history and the same sort of scale that perhaps the Western civilizations have in gathering soil data and providing that information. And so it is essential to recognize some of the unique challenges that you face around the globe and the unique use cases that also pop up from those. And so excited for this panel. Looking forward to talking with everyone about that. But hopefully that answers your question.
Oh, that's great. Great. Thank you. When I go to Europe, to Aslan Pearson, who joins us from Rothamsted Research. Aslan, can you again tell us a bit about yourself and how soil health data plays into the work that you do?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm a data scientist at Rothamsted Research. We're one of the oldest agricultural research institutes in the world. We've got some of the world's longest running experiments. Some of the ones I work on are coming up for 200 years old. One is 180. And my job here, I'm an ecologist by training, but I have fallen into doing a lot of the development work for FarmOS here, specifically. At the moment, we're really focusing on capturing data around farm operations, what the minimum data you really need for that to make it useful. We're implementing that on our own farm for our scientific research, but obviously that has impacts further along for other people. And also basically just adapting FarmOS for experiments, which we've only just kind of implemented in the last couple of months. So I'm not a soil scientist, I'm an ecologist. You know, when you ask me about, agricultural value chains and soils, I'm like, name me a value chain that isn't impacted in some way, by soil carbon sequestration. But to give you a little bit of a UK perspective, I guess, we obviously have just been through Brexit. So here we don't really, sorry, this is my cat, likes to take part in the calls. Yeah, so we've just had breakfast. We don't really have much of a soil carbon market. You know, there are some people who are bravely dipping their toe while the rest of us watch, see what happens. The thing we're primarily focused on is we are having to rethink our farm subsidies from the ground up. And what the DEFRA, who are, you know, our version of the USDA, just much smaller and significantly less money, they've gone for public money for public goods. It's very much focused around what you do rather than, you know, demonstrating how much soil carbon you've sequestered. I actually think that's the right approach, at least for the UK. And there's a lot of confusion here at the UK at the moment because we have no idea how those two things are going to fit together. How do the new farm subsidies go together with carbon payments? Because the government doesn't want you to get paid twice for doing the same thing, understandably. And the other thing I'd say from the UK perspective is that I think you guys in the States are really lucky sometimes. You know, a lot of the stuff like with zero tillage, cover cropping, you just have so much more certainty about what does and doesn't work. We, especially when it comes to zero tillage, it's not quite the same for us, being further north in a cooler climate. So yeah, I'd say that's my general overview, my UK perspective. Yeah, and as an ecologist, what value chain does it affect?
Yes. Point well taken. And I'll say that, you know, from a Canadian perspective, again, I'll just add that, again, one of the unique things about Canada is that in part of our country, the weather climate allows cover cropping and other things to work quite well, and part of it doesn't. And I think our own government struggles to try and find the right way to put policy mechanisms in place that are national in scope, but need to reflect very, very different production systems. And so I'll go to Graham, who also joins us from Canada, but maybe closer to you, Aslan, than I am to Graham physically. But you know, Graham, when you look at the work that you do at Biological Carbon Canada, maybe tell us a bit about that and how soil health data plays into that work.
Thank you, Tyler. I think we've certainly listened to the various speakers, we recognize that soil health plays a big role in productivity and things like that. But in Canada, I think since 2007, soil health now is a derivative or has its own derivative. We've been trading carbon in Alberta since 2007. That's put roughly $340 million into Alberta farmers. 40% of our annual acres participated in the regulatory system. We now have a regulatory offset capturing soil health in Canada rather than Alberta. We have both a regulatory market and a voluntary market. We are seeing trading in now utility tokens that have soil health basis to them. We are starting to see delivery contracts now requiring greenhouse gas scope 1, 2, and 3 because the pea plant, as an example, has promised their suppliers a particular footprint. And we're seeing the sale of data itself. So I think the exciting news in this is that soil health now has a financial derivative, for lack of a better way of saying it. It has some challenges in materiality. It has some challenges with evidence. I'd be the first to say protocols hate farmers because there's no profit. You have to build it. We're seeing an expansion of the software side. We're seeing expansion of the verifiers, adding that. So I think in Canada, we've got an exciting new marketplace beyond just what soil health would deliver for yield for a farmer.
Great, thanks, Graham. And I want to ask you a question. We'll go picking up on something Aslan said a minute ago, and then go around and ask the question to all four panelists. But she spoke about the minimum data and how they're moving to approach of collecting the minimum data needed at the research facility and trying to understand what that is. You know, Graham, if you look at all of those different markets, the different derivatives that are there, all of the issues, you know, is there a good understanding, a good agreement around what the minimum data is that needs to be collected to enable all of that to work?
Yes, but it's like watching hamburger, being made, or you don't want to visit the abattoir. You've got two basic approaches. One is you have a project data approach. So somebody has done the science and you have to provide the material evidence that the soil has changed, whether or not it's an annual sales or carbon. It's got to have a haircut. And when we're dealing with markets, this also has to permanently leave. So you can't have your soil data as you do it go up and down. The second model, which is probably getting further and better, is the model approach. So you have good science, it is applied on a landscape, and then you're looking for proxy pieces of evidence to say this has happened, and that's what is applied to the farm. So it is in the case of, let's say, the protocol here in Alberta, the science was applied in two rough regions, northern Alberta and southern Alberta, and every farm was treated the same. So both of those methods are work. It becomes very expensive for the farm on a project basis because you're having to build materiality evidence. So that means it's no longer just 4 soil samples across all of your farm. You're starting to get in the range of 300 samples, geology reference, so that you have evidence grade data rather than ordinary fertility grade data.
And so Andrew, I'd like to get your answer to this question again. When you're looking at marketing into a marketplace, into different buyers, is there a good understanding of what that common data need is across the markets and across buyers?
Yeah, within the carbon portion of our value proposition, it's well understood. So our clean energy regulator, it uses the project method that our Canadian friend just described. Basically, it's directly measured. One of the things that we can do from the development of hyperspectral technology and having such a rich data set of existing soil samples is move to less sampling being required and greater sophistication in our stratification. So with respect to carbon, with respect to those markets, it's very well understood, it's codified. With respect to green provenance and production benefits, and whether that data is well understood and valued by supply chains, say not as well. And I'll give you some examples of that. Where we're seeing in Australia that a lot of movement and activity by our major lenders and our big supply chains is around hyperspectral satellite imagery, verifying outcomes on a landscape scale. And I think that has got some basis, particularly if you're paying in post-measurement phases. But the reliance over here, or the almost zealot-like belief in the factory has no roof and we can see everything of value just through hyperspectral satellites, I think is really dangerous. And what we're seeing from the farmers is actually, you need farmer data derived from the context to explain things like genetics and breed and nutritional quality and all of these other things that simply the soil carbon result doesn't bring into the picture. And so for green provenance, carbon is a bad proxy, right? And for production, carbon isn't necessarily a good proxy at all, depending on the type of agricultural system here in Australia that we're using. So yeah, look, it's sort of a sliding scale. The market market is starting to appreciate the production benefits, and the word regen is moving into the consumer concept. So we're getting lots of meat supply chains wanting to prove the regenerative capacity of and the practices of farmer through data and show off. And eventually they'll want to convert that show off into buying carbon plus the commodity from the farmer. But in the meantime, there's sort of 3 distinct areas: that production data valued by the farmer, starting to be valued by the consumer; the green provenance data, where the market is obsessed with tech observable through space, but kind of blind to the context. And in carbon, it's completely codified, the relationship between that soil health indicators and the market they're paying on directly measured, yeah. I'll give others a turn. Otherwise I can talk.
Thank you. And so we'll come to Jordan in a minute on that tech piece, but Aslan, I wanted to go back to you because Andrew talked about soil carbon data being a proxy or being a bad proxy for some things. If you go back and put your ecology hat on, I'm sure that you've got some perspectives around how that soil data may be being used or trying to be used as a metric to assess. Again, in Canada, biodiversity gets to be a big issue. I think they're looking at these broader conservation goals. How do you see how soil health data is or does not work as a proxy or tool for these broader issues?
I mean, well, I think I was listening to an amazing point, right? Because especially in agriculture, I have been speaking to a couple of farmers here, some of them who've been the longest zero tillers in the country, and they seem to reach a point where their yields either stagnate or start to decline after a prolonged period. And I don't really know why, but one of the things I suspect, having spoken to some of our soil scientists, is they actually have too much carbon in their soil now, right? And these guys, they buy into this. It's a way of living for them. It's a part of who they are, not just what they sell. And so when you say to them, I think you should consider maybe plowing, inverting your soil, or like trying to readdress that carbon nitrogen balance you've got going on, they really say no. But in my head, I'm looking at it like, I think you have to be very careful telling people that you're going to put all of the carbon into agricultural soils. And for me as an ecologist, it's always a trade-off, right? Like, okay, great, I absolutely agree, you should be doing everything you can to improve agricultural soils, but there needs to be, it's not really a trade-off, but there needs to be a piece of this which is like, okay, and then which bits go into natural regeneration? Like, what are we doing, where are we doing it, and why are we doing it in those locations? Have we thought through what we're doing, where and why? And how you get that to translate through to a financial market, I have no idea. All I know is it's really important because you've got to get the right incentives, right? How do you make the right financial incentives to match, the right kind of outcomes, in part producing food and in part, restoring so much of our degraded habitat. So it's a really interesting point. I don't have an answer, only a lot of observations.
Right. Well, I appreciate that. And so Jordan, when you look at the work that you see around the world and trying to connect this the satellite observation with soil health results and linking it into other data, how much of the solution of making that all fit together is where a solution building the patches that feed this all in to be able to make it all work, or how much of the solutions that you see come from different technology or different processes?
Yes, well, fortunately, I am not on the policy or finance side of most of our work. And so I'm glad to stay away from that just out of my own interest. So I can talk to the tech side. And I believe that what Andrew and what Graham both are talking about here in terms of modeling and spectrometry is going to be the necessary future for this, because in order to increase the amount of soil samples that can be had and therefore increase the size of the soil health data that is available to farmers and to people working all throughout the different steps of the agricultural chain, we're going to have cheaper ways to measure what is happening within the soil than physical samples. And so being able to access either hyperspectral imagery or just, old-fashioned multispectral imagery now will be able to, it helps to fill in that gap of what is unaffordable at the moment to make it to where the data becomes more accessible. To speak a bit further about beyond carbon, as I mentioned, with carbon, a lot of these things are already very codified, and that there are distinct ways in which we can expect to measure it and distinct ways in which we expect it to move towards monetization. But it is important to remember that carbon, I have to say, I find it hard to overemphasize how important carbon can be in the soils and the amount of benefits that it can bring to an agricultural system. But everyone is correct. That is not the be all end all. There are other aspects that must be measured independent of carbon, and that must also be brought into management decisions and just information for the farmers to understand whether or not their yields are going to be increasing this year. Fortunately, there are methods of also measuring the soil moisture, the density of the soils, and some of the macronutrients as well. That, again, I appreciate Andrew's, how skeptical he is about some of this, with the idea of the roof is off, we can see everything clear as day. That's not always true. There's plenty of systems, plenty of research that needs to be done to determine what sort of cropping systems can we detect what is happening with the soil very accurately. And some of that is held back by there being unique cropping systems throughout the world that aren't done at a very large scale. And therefore, there is not a whole lot of incentive for people to launch research projects into those sort of systems. And then also by, of course, the lack of soil data, or the lack of at least interoperability of samples that have been taken over the past, as this whole conference is about. And so the skepticism is fair. It's worth looking at these things individually, separate from soil carbon, and they must be researched by themselves to determine the benefits that they can bring to farmers and to their yields. But as I mentioned, after that, once it moves into the finance portion, beyond me. But I do appreciate the thoughts I'm hearing from everyone else so far on this, on the tech side.
Well, and so Jordan, we had a question from an audience, from Rob Trice, asking about monitoring and verification. Again, I do think that does fall into that technological wheelhouse that you're in. When you look at the work that you're doing, is it how are you doing that monitoring and verification? Is it remote hyperspectral or ground-based or both?
Yes. So currently what we do is we're very fortunate in the sense that we have over 1 million. I don't think we have 2 million soil samples, but over 1 million within our project areas across the globe. And so we are able to have very large training sets in order to format our measurement models on. After which, yes, it is correct that we are using multispectral, hyperspectral, different satellite wavelengths in order to form the relationship of what is happening within the soils based on what we have historically seen happening based on our soil samples. With that combination together, that allows us to do two things. The first one is to do MRV and monitoring of what is currently happening within the soil and then in the future, so that we can track soil carbon changes as a project actually launches. The second, which is perhaps of more value depending on what someone's focus is the historical analysis. Because as long as those satellites have been up, or similar satellites operating with the same wavelengths, we can continue to do a historical analysis. This helps to deal with some of the issues that we've been talking about, of checking to see whether or not changes have happened in the past when new practices were either said that they were implemented or were actually implemented. Those changes should be detectable. They should be something that should be measurable. And so now we are not just blindly believing that something happened in the past, or guessing about whether or not it had improvements based on anecdotal advice that someone might say about, well, it looked greener this year than last year. It's now able to put numbers along with this and to quantitatively base our new management decisions about how these fields have performed in the past. So yes, the monitoring and verification is done through satellites. In addition to that, validation stages, of course, happen where new soil samples are pulled, because these things will have to continue to be measured, both to update models and measurement systems, but also to verify the results that we are getting from our current models.
And
Tyler, I'm going to chime in here because the definition of verification is very important, at least in the Canadian context. Verification is not new evidence. Verification is an audit process to ensure that the protocol or the practice as defined has been done correctly. We have certainly challenges, as Jordan talked about the new satellite. Things like if the satellite approach is not in the approved evidence in the first place, it doesn't count. So you have a chicken and egg, which comes first. So understand that if you need a new word for new evidence. So if you're coming along and something says, did this practice happen? Then that's an evidence collection discussion, not a verification discussion, at least in the Canadian context.
Thank you. And so Graham, we'll stick with you. And again, I think Martha may give me a bit of trouble, but I'm going to try and steal a couple of extra minutes to go around and ask one of those policy questions that Jordan maybe isn't interested in answering, but I'm sure Graham, Aslan, and Andrew have a perspective on it. The question came in response to something that Aslan had mentioned earlier from Steve Francis. Are you saying that the focus should be on maximizing soil health, not maximizing carbon capture? In response to a comment you made earlier, I'm curious from the European, Canadian, Australian perspective. When we look at how soil carbon is playing into marketplaces, how the state really, I think, is being attracted into the carbon marketplace today. How is that impacting that broader dialogue discussion around soil health is more than, a measure of soil or organic carbon? Are we getting that right balance, right? So Aslan, I'll go back to you on that.
Well, I'm going to be an ecologist and say it's not even about soil health, it's about ecosystem restoration, especially for us in the UK. We face some really interesting and complex challenges. So, for example, one of the best ways for capturing carbon for us is in our peatlands. And our peatlands, at least around Cambridge, there's some of our primary agricultural land, right? So, yeah, you want ecosystem restoration, but that then comes at the cost of food security, which at the moment obviously is a huge discussion as well. And what I think concerns me is people, they seem to separate things. They don't see, there's soil carbon, which is a component of soil health, and soil health is a component of ecosystem function. And I understand why people pick their small, narrow areas of interest, because to put all of those things together, it's hard enough understanding a teeny tiny little piece. But I do think that's really important. And what I would like to see personally going forward in future at a very farm level is not just an agronomist, but, an agricultural ecologist or an ecologist who can work with you to say, okay, this is great, but, realistically for your farm, this is where you should be aiming. And in terms of policy, like Jordan, I wouldn't want that job because it's just so hard. How do you balance those incentives at different local and national scales? It's not an easy job. But yeah, I think that's what I'd really like to see. People who can be the generalist specialists outside of, just agriculture.
And so Andrew, if you look at the marketplace that you're selling into, is that balance there? Do people understand the difference?
I think my opening comment remains the market side doesn't necessarily understand the difference, but the farmers certainly do. And generally, philosophically, I think we haven't paid the true cost of our commodities and paid farmers appropriately for nutrition and public services that they provide through their ecosystems. And so, the step towards carbon as a proxy for climate, greenhouse gases, etc., is sort of financializing nature and providing new incentives. And certainly it's the market opportunity that's created the opportunity for the mutual and the opportunity for farmers to have a greater say. Just also to Aslan's point, we have this role in Australia, landscape agronomists, and they're trying to, take those food and fibre production and marketing skills of traditional agronomy and mix them with those landscape scale, hydrology, biodiversity corridors, ecosystem function. And so that's a real career now that is enabled by the mutual, where landscape agronomists are supporting in location a group of our members to not only individually do what they can on their farm, but collectively do what they can in their catchment or corridor. And yeah, so I think, at least in Australia, we're sort of heading in that right direction. I'll make two other points. I really think that we call it measurement, verification and reporting as opposed to MRV. And the technology hyperspectral stuff is really good if we can combine it with a post-date instrument. What we're doing in Australia, and I think is folly around the world, is we're sort of gathering baseline data and projecting 25 years out and paying on that basis, and then we've got unders and overs and it's shithouse. And I think we should just be measuring and paying in arrears based on performance and that is going to be much better use of hyperspectral than projecting out into the future based on past performance. And that, you know, MVR in Australia is about IoT, peer-to-peer, and what the farmer is inputting about their context. Where did the practice change come from? What turned that patch green? Was it urea or was it a biological fertilizer? Was the biological fertilizer off their own circular waste, or did they bring that in from town? You know, like all those sorts of things come from multiple sources of MVR that collectively bring together a much finer picture for the farmers and enable them to make better decisions. And if you've got all that data, as farmers do in our scenario, in their digital twin, well, then it proves their provenance claims, or it proves their environmental market claims, and it's sort of irrelevant, you know, as to which market or monetization method they're using. It's all the same data. Sorry.
Tyler, you can't make good management decisions on farm with good data, without good data. So it means things like, if you're doing soil samples, put it on steroids, same time, same place, same depth. So you're building that data protocol. If you're dealing with greenhouse gas emissions, ultimately, you got to look at both sides of the scale, your soil and your consumables. So without that data, you've got farm managers that are, you know, here in the audience that are struggling to make decisions. You've had 100 years of figuring out what your NPK is on your farm. Let's add soil bulk and soil health so that you've got data to make decisions. And then from that, then you're entering into a new commodity, kind of what we're talking about, and it will require data. No different than requiring data now that requires the selling of your derm or animals with a data package. They're paying for it, but you have to have the data.
Right. That's a good, clear note to end on. Martha, thank you for going to sneak some extra time in. Over to you.
Great. Thank you, Tyler, for moderating. Thank you, Jordan, Graham, Andrew, and Ashlyn for doing this. I really appreciate it. Great insights.